Hello and welcome to this episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast, brought to you by Nova's Strategy and Consulting with Pete Gatenby and myself, Chris Williams. In today's episode, the topic is interoperability, and we're going to be talking about what this means to you, your organisations across the home buying ecosystem and the rest of financial services. So let's get into it. Hi, Pete.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm very keen to get into the topic today. Because it's one that we've been hearing a lot about really for quite some time, but I think it's become more and more prevalent in particularly in financial services and the home buying ecosystem in more recent months.
And it's interesting, right? Because I always think when a phenomenon gathers its own term, you know it's getting momentum.
Absolutely. Now, we've got some research work that's been going on specifically in and around the lending community recently, and interoperability has been one of the big things that's come up as an inhibitor, as something that's perhaps slowing things down when it comes to driving through change and transformation. Before we get into the real detail of this, let's talk firstly so everybody's on the same page. What is interoperability and why does it actually really matter?
At its core, interoperability, which is a mouthful to say when you're from the north, but interoperability is refers to the connected web of systems, processes, people across the ecosystem, how they communicate, how they coordinate, and ultimately how they're connected. We call it the 3 C's when we talk about this when we're working with our clients. But yeah, that's it at its core. It's that connection between across the network, and typically what you see is any process or a value stream that sees something pass from one end to the other without a required physical or manual intervention.
So a couple of things then. Excuse me. 3 C's is all about connectivity, communication and cooperation, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. But in the context of financial services, the home buying sector, really what we're saying here is, in summary, that interoperability is all about, there's an ecosystem and it's about making that a connected ecosystem. And if we look at the ecosystem today, digitally it's not connected end to end. It's not in terms of flow efficiency. Something doesn't start at the process at the beginning and flow seamlessly through a digital connectivity. It's very much a hybrid of digital, physical, and a cross between those two things is what essentially we're saying.
Yeah, and typically you have different levels of interoperability, right? You could have technical interoperability. How do technical data get passed from one place to another? You could have semantical, you could have systematic, or equally you could have the fourth, otherwise known as organizational. So there's different levels, really.
Yeah. So we understand kind of what it is, but why does it really matter now? Why is it very pertinent now in today's world?
Well, it's critical right now because we've sort of seen the first transformation as banks have digitised. Everyone's digital, right? And lending's digital. All your application process is digital. And what we've seen within the home buying market specifically is you've seen vertical digitisation of each individual element of the process.
Yeah.
But the next phase, the future phase, and this is what we're talking about a lot, right? What we're involved in a lot is that horizontal, integrated, interoperable transformation. So transformation from one end of the process to the other.
So we're going vertical to horizontal, basically, and that's why it matters, because it's the enablement of how do we enable horizontal transformation? Well, we need to become interoperable. This is the genuine, cross collaboration now.
Absolutely. When we talk about collaboration all day, every day, because we're seeing it now. It's not just even within a single organisation, and it's not even within a single part of the market or part of the industry. Lenders are having to coordinate with the conveyancing organisations, who are having to coordinate and work closely with the suppliers into the market and the vendors in the market. There's this kind of cross collaboration that's required to really facilitate that interoperable requirement that's kind of rearing its head now.
Okay. Turning to challenges, because I think as we build up towards, we've gone through what it is, why it matters. If we look at challenges, and we can then move into the approaches to sort of really help people watching and listening to this, to sort of how they can approach it. What are the real challenges that you're facing and we're facing with this stuff?
The biggest challenge, without a doubt, that we see every day. And I mean, if you've been around the tech world, especially within any part of the FS market, legacy is a big problem. But it's hard, right? Because you've got some institutions that still have intrinsic systems sat on mainframes in the basement with a piece of duct tape to make sure that it's not turned off, because no one's quite sure how it's connected into the overall process. And so if it turns off, their critical kind of processes could go down within the organisation. Add to that the fact that sometimes it's being built by people who might have left the business, might not be involved anymore, or even organisations that no longer exist. And so they can't even be upgraded to be integrated into the process effectively and efficiently, which creates massive barriers technologically to be able to bring those systems into the model as a whole.
So I guess what we're saying is probably one of the biggest constraints for interoperability is essentially legacy and legacy technology, legacy systems.
Yep.
But businesses, lenders especially, banking institutions, they are going through this transformation of trying to upgrade that. But the reality is that's not a small task. It's actually a big task. I believe there's opportunity here, though. Of course, they've got to go through that. But I also think this is where there is opportunity for newer, more cloud native, cloud first type organizations to kind of come in and start to kind of look at this. And I think sort of lenders themselves kind of reinvent themselves about how they could approach this. But if that's sort of one of the key challenges, kind of what we're saying is it's going from old to new. It's the modernization of that. It is taking time. What can be done to try to potentially either accelerate this, and what are the other challenges that potentially are there?
There's a few different ways you can approach this, but the first step, going back to last week's podcast, is really to map the value stream. Start there, work out where the touch points are into those legacy systems. Perhaps bridge. Look, we talk about bridging from a technical aspect of bridging between two systems, perhaps pulling something else out in between. But actually, in a process standpoint, sometimes mapping the value stream as part of a process exercise is super important to understand what's being done just because it's always been done. Not actually an integral need for the regulators or an integral need for the customer experience. It's just something that's always been done, and therefore no one really knows why, and they just do it because that's habit or that's part of the process and has always been part of the process. And actually what happens is, if you don't do that, you become bloated from a process and technological standpoint, because you have more steps to go through, whether that's to build technical features to deliver a certain part of the process, or even part of the customer experience. The customer experience can become bloated. Now, I always go back to this, and obviously it's a company we've worked with closely. When I tried opening a joint bank account with my now missus and now wife, we tried opening Santander, and we couldn't do it because there were so many steps we had to go through. And then I got targeted on Instagram by Starling at the time, and that was obviously when they were going through a big push to try and get people onto the Starling platform. And I clearly got targeted by some magic social media targeting, and we went through the process of opening a Starling bank account in a matter of minutes. And versus Santander, we'd gone through the initial process, and then we were going to have to wait for some paperwork to come through the door. Why? Starling had identified they could do all this with new cloud-based technology, do the ID, exactly,
ID verification,
and go through that process super quick. Now you start applying that to the home buying market. You go through the process of mortgage. The same principle is now being applied. And so but you can only really identify what's bloat, unnecessary requirements in the process by value stream mapping it. So that's always the first step. Bit of a long answer to your question there, but value stream map first.
But I think it's so important, and we do have to dig into the detail of this stuff sometimes, I think, because our principal objective of these conversations is trying to deliver value to people so that they can try to kind of understand it. So I think it's good to get into the detail a little bit, and sort of help people out. But what next then? What else have we got?
The next thing that I'd do is look at collaboration across complementary services in the industry. Now, again, the home buying process, we live in quite a lucky ecosystem in the fact it's quite well defined, thanks to the British way of buying a house. Everyone goes through the same main steps when buying a property, right? Or going through the mortgage process. And so that's quite well defined, but it requires collaboration between a number of different parties. But actually that requires a cultural change, because historically there's been this, no, we are a business, we are looking out for our individual needs, we're working to go on this journey, these are our strategic objectives, and everyone else will exist around us. Whereas now we're moving to a point in the industry, and I say moving, we're there really. If you're not doing this, you're sort of behind the times really, where lenders, building societies are collaborating, conveyancers are collaborating, not just between one to the other, but between themselves, because there's efficiencies as a collective. And obviously we're involved in a number of those projects today. But if you're not doing that and you're a player in this market, you are going to be left behind, because the sum of the totals is always going to be greater than the individual. And so that's kind of the second tip. Have you got a third?
From an approach standpoint, I guess it's building on the collaboration piece, because I think a lot of people look at this and say, well, how do we get involved? How do we collaborate? What's the best approach to collaboration? And I think there's something that's actually fundamental to this. If we look at, and this is actually agnostic to any industry sector, it's actually data. Actually, what enables interoperability and enables an end-to-end process, as I say, agnostic, irrelevant of industry sector, is actually the data, the upfront data piece. The upfront data piece is going to be mission critical to enabling the whole ecosystem to become connected, because when we look at the value stream and we look at what happens in each of these individual areas, there's repetitive functions that take place, ID check being one of them. There's lots of different examples of that. And so the third one for me really would be actually building on the approach, the data side of it. Now, there's a lot happening there in terms of data standards trying to be pulled together, and there's lots of work that's going on around that. But for me, that'd be probably the third one. But it's to play a role in shaping that, and to do that unselfishly. And what I mean by that is that typically when industry collaboration starts to take place, the old world tends to creep in, whereby everybody's turning up with a bit of an agenda and wanting to kind of put their agenda first before actually the agenda of how do we make this better for the end consumer. And then we'll kind of how do we then make that sort of mutually beneficial and commercially viable. These are commercial entities at the end of the day. But collaboration is about a common goal and a common objective, and that has to be to make the customer experience better. So that'd be my view on it.
So let's get down to how it's actually benefiting the market. What are some use cases that can really?
I think the biggest one is streamlining data exchange. That's got to be, and that comes from the upfront data piece first and foremost. But secondly, this is where true collaboration really matters, because that's streaming that data is all about people coming together.
Yeah, and how many times have we sat in meetings where there's discussions about data structures from two conflicted parties?
Well, I think all very much so. But I think here's the thing, have an open API strategy. What's your interoperability strategy? All players need to start to think about that. All players need to start to think about it.
And this is it, right? We're talking to people in the market, and every single one of them is saying that customer experience is at the core of their strategic objectives. But actually, when you go a layer down, the facilitation of that is data is the currency. And so warring and arguing about the best data structure for the data being passed between, no one wins. The customer definitely doesn't win. So fundamentally, you're not going to achieve that core strategic objective that's being set out at the top level in lenders and conveyancers and vendors.
The forward-thinking companies in the market, which I'm pleased to say we work with them. They do look at it in that way, and there's open-mindedness, and there's an absolute focus to how do we make this better for the benefit of all. That's a phrase I hear a lot, and I'm I think we're very fortunate to be working with organisations that are thinking that way.
And that's it, right? It means customer going through the mortgage application process, it becomes streamlined, no matter who they're going to, right? When it comes to actually the transaction, exchange of funds, everything of that ilk becomes much easier.
So kind of getting to the closing points of this, we've talked about what it is, why it matters, the challenges around legacy. That seems to be very much in the kind of lending community on the legacy side. But I think the legacy side, actually, from a conveyancing standpoint, there's potential legacy inside of conveyancers as well from a technology standpoint. But I think that I actually think for the conveyancing community, I think they're actually in a real good space. I think they're in a real good spot right now. Let me put some context behind that and what I mean. At the Conveyancing Association event a few weeks ago, we mentioned it on the last week's podcast. I spoke to a number of conveyancers in that room, and I was observing them engaging with the panel discussions, and something really, really stood out. And it stood out I was there last year as well. The maturity, the digital maturity inside conveyances is at a good level. They don't need convincing that digital technology is something that they need to adopt. They're absolutely on board with it, and I think it's fantastic to see. I don't talk to any conveyancers that are not thinking digital first. They're cautious and they're of things, and they're risk averse by nature, and rightly so, given what they do. But they're absolutely ready to adopt technology. So my point is that when it comes to legacy systems, the legacy that they have isn't something that's been self-created, because they procure in technology typically. Now, some of the bigger organisations, some of the bigger conveyances, they've got their own, but they've got technology leadership. So I think you can break the conveyancing group down into kind of three groups really. You've got your kind of larger organisation, which is the technology strategy is internally CTO led. You've then got your mid tier, which is they'll have perhaps some technology people within it, but they'll be very vendor reliant, and it'll be sort of
almost custom builds.
Kind of a little bit, and then you'll have your more smaller firms that are just
taking things off the shelf.
And the technology decisions will typically be done by the managing partner, managing director, whatever else. They won't have internal technology staff. But I think they're in a great position because actually they're ready to consume, they're ready to make changes, they're organising themselves in that way, and their job is hard, right? It's not easy, and so it's a long-winded answer of saying legacy that exists there is opportunity, because actually where they procure new services and technology from, the recommendation to them really is make sure you're looking into the market for organisations that have got a forward-thinking mindset, that are demonstrating collaboration, that are demonstrating open interoperability, and how they're kind of bringing that to you. And I think from a vendor selection point of view, from a conveyancer's vantage point, that's where they should really be kind of looking. So I think it's opportunistic for them versus, say, at the lender arena.
Do you know, it's fascinating, right? And I'm casting my mind back to a discussion a few weeks ago now about low code, no code.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. If you're not tied back by legacy systems, you have the perfect opportunity to even streamline and build things quickly. Now then, it requires a bit of technical nous, of course, but we're starting to have conversations with our clients, right, of, well, actually, there's a part of the process here that you've been complaining about for the last X number of years, but you can build it quite quickly now, where previously you didn't have the technology budget, people, whatever the blocker was, or it's tied to a legacy system, and actually they're starting to replace that with low, no code, supported by AI.
Yeah.
To really push on that as an opportunity.
Well, I think this is where, if we look outside of sort of home buying and financial services, and you look at the small business market in general, okay, let's look at, say, the sales and marketing functions of small businesses of 20 years ago versus today. Bear with me on this one. 20 years ago, you would typically have, people working for you within a 5 to 10 mile radius. You'd have been, maybe had some level of CRM system or whatever else. Now, today, you can pull an off-the-shelf email marketing platform from we'll just pick any vendor out of the market. The first one that springs to mind is MailChimp. You could have HubSpot as a CRM platform, or any other for that matter, and you could have Stripe as some sort of payment mechanism. How do I create interoperability between those three platforms? Zapier.
Yeah.
I can, with a Zap as it's now known, and I'm connecting it together. So like this stuff's easy, and that take that level of thinking and start to bring that into these sorts of industry spaces. This is where things start to accelerate, and when we see what's happening inside organisations, they're thinking like this, and all credit to them. And more, let's have more of this.
Yeah, because there's so much opportunity, because it's such a defined process.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing about, we talk about maturity and digital maturity, but I think there's operational as well. I think when you look at it, if you've got we talk about standards and frameworks and things like that, and obviously these are sort of quite consultative, but these can, value stream mapping, you understand your value stream, you can go and do this sort of stuff. And I think where we're obviously both agreeing on it, where we're heading with this is quite simply, today you can be a master of your own destiny pretty quickly if you can get your head around these things. And I think that this market, especially now, has started to reach this. It's kind of there, really, this maturity level where it's like, we don't need to be pitched anymore that digital's good. Yeah. We're now all digital first, but we want to become digital native. And actually, in order to do that, we're kind of looking outwards to say, well, come and bring us some tooling that enables us to do it.
Yeah.
So it's easy to do.
And the thing is, if there isn't something out there to be brought to them,
they'll do it themselves.
Exactly.
And so I think we said it earlier in the year at the start, predictions. I think it's going to be a very exciting time. I think there's some really good stuff here. Look, I think we've covered quite a lot in that session. We'll draw it to a close now.
Would you have any final piece of advice?
Yeah, well, I was about to say what are our kind of top tips. We usually end with PG top tips, because obviously Pete Gate and PG tips.
And I've taken to having a cup of tea when we do this. And I don't normally drink tea. I don't know why.
Well, as a staunch Yorkshireman, I thought you'd be right up there with your cup of tea, but there you go. Look, I think we'll share the tips then. My top thing is a bit cliched, but collaborate. I'm going to give a bit of detail around that and how. Attend this, attend the industry stuff, but collaborate in from the perspective of solutionize. How can we genuinely start to solve some of these problems around interoperability? That would be my first thing, and start to engage with this at all levels, wherever you sit in the ecosystem. In your mind, just get to the point of, right, we need to be a connected ecosystem. How do we make that happen? Let's start solutionizing around that.
Cool. My top tip is around data, actually. You need to understand your data. It's the lifeblood of pretty much everything we do, especially when we start talking about value stream mapping, because data runs through it. Understand your data, understand where it's stored, understand what it is, understand where you need it to be at what time, because typically that's quite important. Once you understand that, you start to map it and do exciting things with it.
I think we'll end on there. There's a few other things that we could say around compliance governance, but I think the industry know all about this stuff. So we'll kind of leave it there. So I think that's been a really good one, and hopefully likewise for the people watching and listening, there's some nuggets in there that'll be useful and helpful.
Perfect.
So that concludes today's episode of the Digital Disruption Podcast. We hope you found it useful and insightful, as we said in the wrap up there. But for now, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you, and you'll hear from us again very soon.
Thank you.